falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. I believe that question is interesting because often the comments we hear about the crisis of trust we have in our democracy tend to argue something like we are losing trust and trust is disappearing from our societies. And I'd like to challenge that idea a little bit around what I believe the phenomenon which I believe we are observing, which is that trust is currently in tension, a little bit like a piece of fabric. The two sides are trying to take from themselves, from each other. And this begins with the observation that human beings are social animals. We live in societies and we cannot function without trust. Now, of course, at an individual level or at certain times of crisis, personal crisis or societal crisis, there can be varying total levels of trust. But I do not think that a society can function without trust. The thing is that since the emergence of liberal democracies in the 18th and 19th centuries, we have been used to the concept, the idea of the nation state, and that the leadership of the nation state, the government of the nation state, should gather the trust of the population. And of course, that is essential. The thing is, however, that as human beings, we tend to trust multiple communities, individuals. And what I believe we're observing now is what Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist in the Society of Risk in the 80s, has called the great move of trust to the sub-political realms. I think what we're observing is that levels of trust are changing ownership, and that instead of the general trust that the people should have towards political leaders now, people tend to trust other forms of authority. So society continues to function with trust, but our references tend to multiply, to be diffracted, and then that, as a consequence, provokes a form of fragmentation, social fragmentation. We have different sources of authority when it comes to media consumption, different sources of authority when it comes to belief systems, and trust is leaving one camp, the traditional camp, which is the traditional leadership of our modern democracies, and moving to other spheres. And we are a bit lost because societies have not functioned that way, especially in the West, for a very long time. Now, before liberal democracies in the Middle Ages, populations in Europe were used to having multiple levels of authority and trust, and we do not know how to function in such a situation. I think it will probably take a long time for us to figure out how it is possible nowadays to function with conflicting and different levels of trust. Well, one of the basic rules in times of crisis, the playbook of crisis management, number one is stick to the facts. Find out what the facts are and communicate to the people what the facts are. And in this pandemic, I think, and several of us have mentioned that, we have been faced to a situation where even our leaders had a hard time figuring out what the facts were. And in such a situation, as a leader, your choice is either to create a story that you will tell to make sure that the people's response, the population's response, is what you expect from them, or simply face the truth that you do not know exactly what the facts are. And unfortunately, a lot of what I have observed over the past year and a half is that in many countries, the population reacts as if they were told a story that they do not believe. And I must say I'm very worried for the consequences in the midterm of this perception that the stories that I've been told are not truthful. And you know, true speech and truth telling is one of the essential pillars of trust. You know, you trust someone when, you know, the way they speak to you, the things they describe corresponds to the reality you can observe yourself. If you perceive that what they're telling you does not correspond to the reality you perceive yourself, then you tend not to trust them. Another pillar of trust is integrity, and that's been mentioned by several of us already. And integrity is, in a way, is an effort to do what is best for everyone at every moment, and including things that will not be popular for ourselves if we are leaders. I remember about 6 weeks ago, in the space of 1 week, there were two crises in Germany and in France. In Germany, Angela Merkel made decisions about how to manage the pandemic and entered in a tension with the leadership of the Länder, so the regions of Germany. And 2 days later, had to make public apology, like literally an apology, assuming her responsibility and the fact that she was wrong in what she had done. In that very same week, maybe 1 day later, it might have been the Thursday, the day later, President Emmanuel Macron was interviewed at a press conference, and he was also under fire for certain decisions that he'd made and things which seemed to have been mistakes in terms of decision making. And the journalists were asking him, do you think you should apologize for what you've done? And he literally said, in French, il n'y a pas de mea culpa à faire. There is no no apology to be made. But the phrase mea culpa in Latin is taken from the Catholic liturgy. You know, that's when you confess your sins, you know, and you pray saying, this is my fault. And that's quite interesting that in the space of 1 week, you see two leaders going in two different directions. That's where I believe the population sees integrity and thinks about whether they believe they can trust their leaders or not. These defining moments, should I do something which may be unpopular, may be negative for me, or should I not? The growth and the rise of populism, I believe, that's really the fuel of populism. That's the not in classical political theory, you have this concept of the general will, that the democracy follows the general will, and this is based on the idea that every citizen, every person in society is meant to wish the best thing for the entirety of society as well as themselves. What I'm observing is that we're moving from an exception of a general will, which needs to be expressed, to general unwill. The idea that actually our decision makers are suspicious and that our structures of authority may not mean the best for us as a society. That is really worrying, and I believe that the role of civil society, of as I explained earlier, the multiple levels of trust, we need to stop and try and figure out how we can rebuild that trust in that basic idea that in a society we need to look for the best for the entirety of society as well as ourselves. Reestablish this concept of the positive general will, of the common good in another language. Ultimately, I believe that the authority to decide which is a conspiracy theory or not is the individual. It's up to you. Now, this does not exhaust the problem. There's a quote from a writer named Jonathan Swift in the early 18th century. A writer said, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. It's always so hard to try to establish that something is false when people are already inclined to believe a message which is false. And I try to do that, because I do, like I'm sure all of you do. I do have people around me who are sensitive to some of the narratives that are put out there, which to me sometimes sound ludicrous. And I think I'm more interested in understanding why they tend to believe such narrative. I found that many people uh, whom we could say believe conspiracy theories are generally not as convinced as we may believe they are of their narratives. But often what happens is a desire to know the truth, um, to um, to be empowered, and that actually is a much more interesting conversation. Now, it is true that this has real life implications, right? It leads to people not respecting, public health mandates, or not getting vaccinated, or things of that sort. But ultimately, the individual is sovereign, and we cannot force people to do things that are against their will. And I believe that freedom of speech is a value we need to uphold. Um, as much as I dislike, seeing certain stories or messages online or repeated by people around me, messages should be out there, and they should be there in the open, and because they're all the more open to criticism, and then ultimately people can make up their own minds. Because otherwise, it's like fighting fire with fire. Sometimes it works, but generally it doesn't.